The Holy Gospel according to John. Jesus said to the Jews who had believed in him, "If you continue in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will make you free." They answered him, "We are descendants of Abraham and have never been slaves to anyone. What do you mean by saying you will be made free?" Jesus answered them, "Very truly, I tell you, everyone who commits a sin is a slave to sin. The slave does not have a permanent place in the household. The son has a place there forever. So if the son makes you free, you will be free indeed." The gospel of the Lord. Well, it is Reformation Sunday. I always like it. It always gives me a chance to talk about Martin Luther and why we need a Reformation. Sometimes I think we still need a Reformation, not just in our church, but in every church. Well, last year, as you remember, we talked a good bit about Martin Luther and the Reformation, and that's a theme that's worth carrying on. Why did we need a Reformation? Well, quite simply, there were things going on nearby to where Luther was located. He was in Saxony, and there were things that were going on there that were a little bit perplexing to him. Okay, a lot perplexing. He had heard about this guy who was going around selling these things called indulgences. Now, we need to be clear that Luther's argument was not with the Catholic Church in general. It wasn't an argument with the Pope, not yet. It was an argument with a specific archbishop, the Archbishop of Mainz, who had actually bought that position when he was about, I think, 16 years of age. 16 years of age. And he has the power of the archbishop. At 16, I could be bribed with a whole lot of things. Give me an extra piece of fried chicken on my plate, and you could bribe me to do just about anything. I'm not sure things have changed that much. Anyway, so the archbishop now is wanting to build his own cathedral that is going to rival St. Peter's Basilica that is being built in Rome. So he begins reinstituting the practice of selling indulgences. Okay, what's an indulgence? An indulgence simply was supposed to be a means of getting you out of penance here and now. Here's what would happen. On a Saturday, you go in to say your confession to the priest. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. It's been a week since my last confession." "Very well, my son, what have you done?" "Well, I got into a bit of a bar fight on Friday night, and yeah, tore things up a good bit and went home drunk." "Well," the priest says, "what you need to do is say, I don't know, 3 Our Fathers and 1 Hail Mary, and don't do it anymore." Okay, off you go. All right, so things get a little worse. "Bless me, Father, for I've sinned. It's been a week since my last confession, and I had gotten drunk on Friday night, went to the bar, cleaned the place out, wrecked everybody, tore up the bar, went home, beat my children, and yeah, I'm sorry about that." "Well," the Father says, "what you're going to have to do is 10 Hail Marys and 20 Our Fathers." You get the point. The worse the sin, the greater the act of penance you were supposed to do. Sometimes, if things were pretty bad, the priest would tell you to go to the nearby town and spend every weekend for the next 6 months helping to build the new cathedral or the new church or the new rectory that was being built. And off you go. That's how you make your penance. So along comes the idea of selling indulgences. That is, you buy this indulgence, a chart of paper, and you can present it to the priest. And it gets you out of doing the penance here and now. You go to the priest, bless me, Father, for I've sinned. It's been a week since my last confession. And in that week, I did this and this and this and this and all these heinous things. And the priest goes, well, what you're going to have to do now. And the guy pulls out the paper and he goes, not so fast, Padre. Got an indulgence. Oh, well, okay, go in peace. Nice. So you can imagine on a Friday afternoon after guys had gotten their paycheck, they're wanting to load up on these indulgences because they got some sinning to do. Well, it gets better than that. A guy named Johann Tetzel starts selling these, and he comes up with this brilliant plan, economically brilliant, to not only have this apply to temporal in this life penances, but it could actually get you out of purgatory. If you buy this indulgence, your time in purgatory could be shortened, and buying enough of them could get you out altogether. Not only that, you could use the indulgence to get someone else out of purgatory, a loved one. Uncle Joe was quite the sinner in his time, but we want to get him out of purgatory. So we buy all these indulgences. The family all pitches in and gets him out of purgatory a few thousand years early. In fact, there was a little jingle that Tetzel and his gang would sing. When a coin in the coffer rings, a soul from purgatory springs. Goodness, it gets better. Not only can you get out of penance in this lifetime, not only can you release your loved one from purgatory or get them out early, you could buy them in advance for yourself or a loved one. I have a child who's young. I'm probably going to die before that child reaches adulthood. So I'm going to load up on penances, not only for me, but for my child, so that no matter what happens, they will be shortened in their time in purgatory. What a racket. It's great. That is what Luther was rejecting. That's what he was arguing against. It wasn't squaring off to fight with the Pope. The Pope at the time, Leo the 10th, was, well, actually, he was a lot like Archbishop Albrecht. His family was the famous and wealthy Medici family, and they had kind of bought the position for him as well. Nevertheless, Leo doesn't seem to be a bad guy, but he doesn't always get the best counsel. So Luther decides to write this list of grievances against Tetzel and the sale of indulgences. 95 statements. Okay, you know where this is going. The 95 Theses. Luther writes down all these documents, all these statements onto this document, and according to legend, nails it to the church door at Wittenberg. Okay, maybe he didn't nail it to the door. Maybe it was to a wall. Maybe it was to us. Anyway, the legend is to tell us that Luther was making a bold stand. Was Luther trying to pick a fight with the Catholic Church? Absolutely not. Luther thought he was a good Catholic. You listen to Pope John Paul II or Pope Benedict or Pope Francis, and they all say that if they had been in Luther's shoes and in Luther's position, they like to think they would have done the same thing. He was rejecting this corrupt practice. Well, he nails it up to the door. He's trying to start a discussion among his theology students. And then, what you know, as always happens, somebody goes and squeals. It gets to the bishop, it gets to the archbishop, it is sent to Rome, and it is kind of like the old telephone game you used to play in elementary school. The teacher would whisper something in a student's ear, and then it would pass along to everybody. And by the time it gets to the last student, it sounds like something completely different. Okay, I'll admit, when I was playing that game when I was in 4th grade or whatever it was, and it would get to me, I would drastically change the message. Somebody tells me the lunch today is going to be shepherd's pie. I would pass on, the New York Yankees stink. Well, okay, so when it gets to the last person, it doesn't have anything to do with lunch. And then the teacher eventually caught on and started tracking down, okay, where did this story fall apart? And it would come back to Travis. Anyway, it gets to Rome, and now Rome, having passed it along to the Pope with all their editorializing of it, gets the Pope riled up, and the Pope sends somebody to talk to Luther. Cardinal Cajetan goes to talk to him. Now, Cardinal Cajetan was an altogether good guy. He himself had gotten in a bit of trouble with the Pope, and so now he's got to be the good little soldier and really bring Luther to task. I think that if they had met under different circumstances and at a different time, Luther and Cajetan would have found concord among themselves. I think they would have found that they had many of the same concerns. But Luther, now being Luther, is a bit agitated. Cajetan, now having to be the strong arm of the Pope, is being a bit stick in the mud, as my grandfather used to say. They're not going anywhere. And maybe if it had been anybody beside Luther or Cajetan to come together, maybe they could have come to agreement. But as it was, and with the personalities involved, they were digging in. Well, they decide to have a debate. A Catholic theologian named Johann Eck decides to challenge Luther to a debate about it, and it becomes this great debate in the city of Leipzig, the Leipzig debate. And Luther does not back down at all. Luther begins to publish. Luther's commentaries on Galatians and Romans were becoming popular. So Luther now is called on to defend these things, these writings, and Luther and Eck battle it out. It only makes things worse for Luther. The Holy Roman Emperor, as Voltaire said, was neither holy nor Roman nor much of an empire, was basically a German empire, and the Holy Roman Emperor was named Charles V. Charles V has the meeting of the Parliament, and at the Parliament, and in the empire, the Parliament was called a Diet, and it was in a place that gives us one of the great titles of world history. The Diet took place in the city of Worms. So Luther had to appear at the Diet of Worms. You got to love that. Luther appears before the emperor, but he's really chastised by some of the representatives from the papacy who are there. He's called to renounce all the writings that he's done so far. More will come. He's called to say that he recants everything. They ask him, Dr. Luther, are you saying that 1,500 years of church history is wrong and you are correct? And Luther answers basically, yeah. Well, they're out to get him. And Luther knows that if he doesn't recant, the chances are very good that he's going to be burned at the stake. And yet, he shows up before the council. You know the famous words. When they asked him to recant, he said, here I stand, I can do no other. God help me. Well, he's allowed to go back home, but everybody knows that when he gets back home, he's in trouble. He will be under arrest. And on the way back home, Luther and his companions were traveling along in a cart, and hooded and masked riders come up, and Luther is taken. They don't know what to do, his companions, they don't know who took him even. And Luther disappears. Well, what we find out is that Luther was actually kidnapped by Prince Frederick, called Frederick the Wise, the Prince of Saxony. He takes him away, hides him in the Wartburg Castle, and Luther will remain there. Prince Frederick never meets Luther. He has always got the what we call the plausible deniability of saying, don't know where he is, never laid eyes on the guy. So Luther is kept away at the Wartburg Castle, and while he's there, he begins to translate the New Testament from the Greek, not the Latin, from the Greek into German. Here's the most remarkable thing. This translation becomes the basis of modern German language. Can you imagine? I mean, we're all fascinated by Professor Tolkien, who created a language for the elves and the dwarves and everybody else in The Lord of the Rings. But Luther has created a language that is still in use today. And it was all based on the New Testament. Fantastic. Later on, he will spend time translating the Old Testament from the Hebrew into the German. And we have a modern German language, not the Gothic German that existed before, but a modern German language based on a translation of the Bible. And it was Luther who did it. And then Luther begins to write what becomes known as the Reformation treatises. He writes to the German nobility of the Christian nobility of the German nation, basically saying, why are we allowing Italians and others to dictate the goings on of our church here in Germany? And then he writes one on the freedom of the Christian. That was huge. The freedom of the Christian. He talks about the priesthood of all believers. He says that all of us, quoting from the New Testament, that we are all kings and priests, and that we can all function as priests. This is the thing that Luther gave us. He gave us access to God. Whereas before, the prayers went through the priest, the sacraments went through the priest, everything went through the priest. The priest was the representative of the people before God. With Luther, things have changed now. With Luther, you can go to God for yourself. There was the famous story of the woman whose child had died before being christened, but Luther said, what did you do and what were your words? The woman tells Luther about it, and Luther says, you're as much a priest as I am. He begins to set us free. The whole document on the freedom of a Christian was something pretty remarkable, based a lot on his writings of Romans and Galatians, to be sure. And remember, Galatians chapter 5, verse 1 opens with, it is for freedom that Christ has made us free. Then it goes on to say, don't submit again to the yoke of slavery, to the bondage of slavery. If there's any one thing that was a theme for Luther, it must be that. The freedom that we have in Christ, the freedom to act as a priest on behalf of each other, the freedom that we have to approach God for ourselves and not through somebody else. That was our need for a reformation. And thank God for it.